Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his own gun, but Wheeler's weapon was already trained on him. The older man's smile was cold and confident, like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "I wouldn't recommend it," Wheeler said calmly. "My men have orders to shoot if they hear gunfire from this room." Jake slowly raised his hands, his mind racing. How had Wheeler known about their plan? Had someone seen them talking in the barn? Or had Sarah betrayed him? "You're wondering how I found out," Wheeler continued, settling back into his chair, but keeping the gun steady. "It's simple, really. I make it my business to know everything that happens on my property. Did you think I would hire a man like you without having you watched?" "A man like me?" Wheeler chuckled. "Please, Jake. I know exactly who you are. Jake Morrison, formerly of the Kansas Territory, son of Robert and Mary Morrison, small farmers who lost their land to drought and died in a cholera outbreak 12 years ago. You've been drifting ever since, working ranches and getting into trouble wherever you go." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Wheeler had done his research thoroughly. "I know about the incident in Colorado, where you killed 2 men who were beating a Mexican family," Wheeler continued. "I know about the trouble in New Mexico, where you stood up to a corrupt sheriff and got run out of town. You have a pattern, Jake. You can't mind your own business. So why did you hire me if you knew all that?" Wheeler's smile widened. "Because I wanted to see what you would do. I was curious how long it would take for you to try to play hero again." He gestured around the room. "Sarah's little fire was quite creative, by the way. She has more spirit than I gave her credit for." Jake's heart sank. If Wheeler knew about the fire, then Sarah was in danger too. "Where is she?" Jake demanded. "Safe, for now. Though that depends entirely on how cooperative you decide to be." Wheeler stood up and walked around the desk, keeping the gun pointed at Jake. "You see, Jake, you've actually done me a favor. Sarah has been unhappy with our arrangement lately, and I was beginning to find her attitude tiresome. But now I have the perfect excuse to make some changes." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Sarah's usefulness to me is coming to an end. She's served her purpose, and, frankly, I'm ready for someone younger and more compliant." Wheeler's eyes glittered with malice. "But I needed a way to dispose of her that wouldn't raise questions in town. You've given me that." Jake felt sick to his stomach. "You're going to kill her." "Not directly. That would be messy and potentially problematic. No, I have something much more elegant in mind." Wheeler walked to the window and looked out at the party below. "Tomorrow, you and Sarah are going to have a tragic accident. A lover's quarrel that turned violent, perhaps. Or maybe a botched robbery attempt. The details don't matter, as long as both of you end up dead. Nobody will believe that." Wheeler turned back to Jake with a smug expression. "Oh, but they will. You see, I've already planted the seeds. Several of my men have witnessed you and Sarah having intimate conversations. Tonight, multiple guests saw you both acting suspiciously. When your bodies are found tomorrow, it will be clear that you were lovers plotting against me, and that your scheme went tragically wrong." Jake's mind raced, looking for a way out of the trap Wheeler had set for them. But the older man had planned everything carefully. There would be witnesses to support whatever story Wheeler decided to tell, and no one in town would dare contradict him. "You won't get away with this forever," Jake said. "Someone will figure out what you're really doing." "Will they?" Wheeler laughed. "I've been operating this way for 15 years, Jake. I own judges, sheriffs, and politicians throughout the territory. The few honest men who have tried to stand against me have met with unfortunate accidents or suddenly decided to relocate to healthier climates." Wheeler walked back to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a thick folder. "These are the documents Sarah wanted to steal, I presume? Financial records, loan agreements, property transfers." He flipped through the papers casually. "All completely legal, I assure you. Unethical, perhaps, but perfectly within the bounds of territorial law. Taking a man's wife as collateral isn't legal anywhere." "Ah, but I didn't take her," Wheeler said smoothly. "She came willingly, as part of a freely negotiated business arrangement. I have her signature on a contract stating as much. She agreed to work for me for a period of 2 years in exchange for forgiveness of her husband's debt plus additional compensation." Jake stared at Wheeler in disbelief. "You forced her to sign that?" "Force is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as providing alternative solutions to difficult problems." Wheeler put the folder back in the drawer and locked it. "The fact is, Jake, that everything I do is legal. Immoral, perhaps, but legal nonetheless. A sound from the hallway made both men. Jake Morrison had seen enough of the world to recognize evil when it crossed his path, and Marcus Wheeler reeked of it from the moment they shook hands. The job offer had come at the perfect time. Jake needed work, and Wheeler needed experienced ranch hands. But something about the man set Jake's teeth on edge. Jake had spent the last 15 years working ranches across the Western Territories, from Montana down to the Mexican border. He had seen good men and bad, honest work and crooked deals, but he prided himself on being able to read people. Wheeler might dress like a gentleman and speak with educated words, but there was something cold and calculating behind his eyes that made Jake's skin crawl. Still, winter was coming, and Jake needed the work. His last job had ended when the ranch owner sold his herd and moved back east, leaving Jake and a dozen other cowboys unemployed. Wheeler's offer of steady work through the winter, plus room and board, was too good to pass up, even if the man himself left a bad taste in Jake's mouth. The first few days at Wheeler's ranch were routine enough. Jake worked with the other hands, moving cattle and mending fences. The pay was good and the food was decent, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the place. It was the silence that bothered him most. On every other ranch Jake had worked, the cowboys talked freely among themselves, sharing stories and complaints about the boss. But Wheeler's men kept their heads down and their mouths shut. When Jake tried to make conversation, they answered in short sentences and quickly changed the subject. Jake also noticed things that didn't make sense for a cattle operation. Wheeler had too many men for the size of his herd, and some of them didn't look like cowboys at all. They carried themselves like gunmen, and Jake had seen the type before in boom towns and border settlements. Wheeler was keeping hired guns on his payroll, which made Jake wonder what kind of trouble the man was expecting. But it was the woman who really caught Jake's attention. Sarah Mitchell was beautiful, there was no denying that, but it wasn't her looks that made Jake take notice. It was the sadness in her eyes and the way she held herself, like someone trying to disappear into the background. Jake had seen that look before, usually on people who had been broken by life and were just trying to survive another day. Wheeler introduced Sarah as his companion, but the way he said it made Jake's jaw clench. There was ownership in his voice, like he was talking about a prize horse or a piece of fine china. And the way Sarah flinched slightly when Wheeler touched her shoulder told Jake everything he needed to know about their arrangement. Jake had been raised by a woman who taught him to respect all people, but especially women and children. His mother had been a frontier woman herself, strong and independent, who had worked alongside his father to build their small farm in Kansas. She had taught Jake that a man's character was measured by how he treated those who couldn't fight back. Over the next few weeks, Jake began to piece together Sarah's story from overheard conversations and careful observation. She had been married to a small rancher named Tom Mitchell, who had borrowed money from Wheeler and couldn't pay it back. The debt had been settled in a way that made Jake's blood boil with anger. Jake had known men like Wheeler before, wealthy, powerful predators who used their influence to destroy lives for their own pleasure. They hid behind lawyers and social status, but underneath they were no better than common thieves and killers. Maybe worse, because they destroyed souls along with lives. The first time Jake spoke directly to Sarah was on a Tuesday morning in early October. Wheeler had ridden into town on business, taking most of his men with him. Jake was fixing a broken gate near the main house when he saw Sarah sitting alone on the front porch, staring out at the horizon with that lost look in her eyes. "Beautiful morning," Jake said quietly, not wanting to startle her. Sarah looked up, seeming surprised that anyone had spoken to her. "Yes, it is," she replied carefully, as if weighing every word. Jake continued working on the gate, but he kept talking in a casual tone. "I'm Jake Morrison, ma'am. Don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Sarah Mitchell," she said after a moment's hesitation. Jake nodded. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Mitchell." He emphasized the Mrs. deliberately, wanting her to know that he recognized her true status regardless of her current situation. Something shifted in Sarah's expression at his words. For just a moment, the careful mask slipped, and Jake saw a flash of the real woman underneath, intelligent, strong, and desperately unhappy. Are you new to this area, Mr. Morrison? Sarah asked, and Jake could hear her testing his intentions. Fairly new, yes, ma'am. Been working ranches most of my life. But this is my first time in this part of Texas. Jake finished with the gate and stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. How about you? You seem like you might be from somewhere else originally. Sarah's smile was sad. Pennsylvania originally. But I've been in Texas for 6 years now. Jake wanted to ask more, wanted to find out about her husband and her child, but he could see Wheeler's men watching from across the yard. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat politely. Well, I better get back to work. Have a good day, Mrs. Mitchell. As Jake walked away, he felt Sarah watching him. Something had passed between them in that brief conversation, an understanding that neither could put into words yet. Over the next several days, Jake made it his business to learn more about the ranch's operations and Wheeler's business dealings. What he discovered made him sick to his stomach. Wheeler wasn't just a successful rancher. He was the leader of what amounted to a criminal organization. He loaned money to desperate families at impossible interest rates, then took their land when they couldn't pay. He had judges and sheriffs on his payroll, ensuring that his actions were always technically legal even when they were morally disgusting. Jake learned about Tom Mitchell's debt and the terrible choice that had been forced on Sarah. He also learned that Sarah had a baby daughter who was being raised by her father while Sarah was trapped in Wheeler's house, like a beautiful bird in a cage. The knowledge ate at Jake's conscience like acid. He had seen injustice before and had always told himself it wasn't his business to get involved. A man had to look out for himself on the frontier. That was how you survived. But something about Sarah's situation was different. Maybe it was the quiet dignity with which she bore her suffering. Or maybe it was the thought of that baby growing up without her mother. Jake began looking for opportunities to speak with Sarah alone, but Wheeler kept her on a tight leash. She was rarely without supervision, and when she was, it was only for brief moments. Still, Jake managed to exchange a few words with her here and there, always careful to seem casual and uninterested to anyone watching. He learned that Sarah was from an educated family back east, that she had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, and that she was far more intelligent than Wheeler probably realized. Jake also sensed that Sarah was planning something, though he couldn't figure out what. The breakthrough came on a cold October evening when Wheeler was entertaining some business associates in the main house. Jake was checking on the horses in the barn when he heard footsteps behind him. Mr. Morrison? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Jake turned around to find her standing in the barn doorway, wrapped in a dark shawl. She looked around nervously before stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Mrs. Mitchell, what are you doing out here? I needed to talk to someone, Sarah said, and Jake could hear the desperation in her voice. I've been watching you, and I hope, you might be different from the other men who work for Wheeler. Jake set down the brush he had been using on the horses and gave Sarah his full attention. What do you need? Sarah took a deep breath. I need help. Not just for me, but for a lot of people. Wheeler is planning something terrible, and I'm the only one who knows about it. What kind of something? Sarah glanced toward the door again, then stepped closer to Jake. He's planning to force more families off their land. I've heard him talking about it with his associates. He has a list of 12 ranches and farms that he wants to acquire, and he's going to use the same methods he used on my husband. Jake felt his anger rising. Debt manipulation. Yes, but worse. He's planning to deliberately sabotage crops and kill cattle to force people into borrowing money. Then, when they can't pay, he'll take everything. Sarah's voice shook with emotion. There are children involved, Mr. Morrison. Families who will lose everything they've worked for. Why are you telling me this? Sarah looked directly into Jake's eyes. Because I think you're a good man. And because I need someone to help me stop him. Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications of what Sarah was asking. Getting involved would mean risking everything, including his life. Wheeler's men were dangerous, and the man himself had too much power and influence to fight openly. But Jake thought about his mother and the lessons she had taught him about standing up for what was right. He thought about Sarah's baby daughter and all the other children who would suffer if Wheeler's plan succeeded. What did you have in mind? He asked finally. Sarah's face lit up with the first real smile Jake had seen from her. I've been thinking about this for weeks. Wheeler keeps records of all his business dealings in a safe in his study. If we could get those records to someone in the territorial government, someone who isn't on Wheeler's payroll, we might be able to expose what he's been doing. That's a big if, Jake said. Getting into Wheeler's study without being caught, finding the right papers, getting them to someone who would actually do something about it. Any one of those things could get us killed. I know, Sarah said quietly. But I can't live with myself if I don't try. Those families deserve a chance to save themselves. Jake studied Sarah's face in the dim light of the barn. He saw determination there, and courage, but also fear. She was terrified of what she was proposing, but she was willing to do it anyway. There's something else, Sarah continued. Wheeler is planning a big celebration next week. It's his birthday, and he's inviting all the important people in the territory. The house will be full of guests and distractions. It might be our only chance. Our chance. Sarah nodded. I know where Wheeler keeps the key to his safe, and I know his schedule well enough to predict when the study will be empty. But I need someone to help me get the papers out of the house, and to someone who can use them. Jake thought about the risks again. If they were caught, Wheeler would kill them both without hesitation. But if they did nothing, how many more families would be destroyed? All right, Jake said finally. I'm in. But we do this my way, and if I say we abort, we abort. No arguments. Sarah's eyes filled with tears of relief. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I don't know how to repay you for this. Just call me Jake, he said with a slight smile. And you don't need to repay me. Some things are just the right thing to do. They spent the next hour planning their operation, speaking in whispers, and constantly listening for footsteps outside the barn. Sarah would create a distraction during the party, something that would draw Wheeler away from the house long enough for Jake to search the safe and copy the most important documents. The plan was dangerous and full of holes, but it was the best chance they had. As Sarah prepared to return to the house, she turned back to Jake one more time. Jake, if something goes wrong, if we get caught, please don't let Wheeler hurt my daughter. Promise me. Jake nodded grimly. I promise, Sarah. Whatever happens, Emma will be safe. The use of her daughter's name brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. She hurried out of the barn and back toward the house, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the weight of what they were planning to do. Jake spent the rest of the night thinking about the plan and all the things that could go wrong. But he also thought about Sarah's courage and determination and about the families who would be destroyed if Wheeler's plan succeeded. By morning, Jake had made his peace with the decision. He was going to help Sarah expose Wheeler's crimes, whatever the cost. It was the right thing to do, and Jake had never been one to back down from doing what was right. The next few days passed slowly as they prepared for the party and refined their plan. Jake gathered information about Wheeler's guards and their routines, while Sarah learned everything she could about the safe and the layout of Wheeler's study. But as the day of the party approached, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Wheeler was too smart and too careful to be caught easily, and Jake had learned to trust his instincts about danger. Still, when the night of the party arrived and Jake saw Sarah's determined face across the crowded ballroom, he knew there was no turning back. They were committed now, for better or worse. The party was everything Wheeler had planned it to be, elegant, expensive, and designed to show off his wealth and power to the most important people in the territory. Jake watched from his position near the back door as Wheeler played the role of gracious host, charming his guests while Sarah stood silently at his side like a beautiful ornament. Jake could see the strain in Sarah's posture and the forced nature of her smile. She was playing her part perfectly, but Jake knew it was costing her dearly. He just hoped she would be able to hold it together long enough for them to execute their plan. As the evening wore on, Jake positioned himself near the main staircase that led to Wheeler's private study. The plan was for Sarah to create a distraction that would draw Wheeler and most of his guests outside, giving Jake time to slip upstairs and crack the safe. At exactly 10 o'clock, just as they had planned, Jake heard shouting from the garden behind the house. Through the windows, he could see people running toward what appeared to be a fire in one of the outbuildings. Sarah had done her part perfectly, and now it was Jake's turn. He slipped up the stairs quickly and quietly, his heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. Wheeler's study was at the end of the hall, and Jake could see light under the door. But When he reached for the handle, the door swung open to reveal Wheeler standing behind his desk with a gun in his hand and a cold smile on his face. "Hello, Jake," Wheeler said calmly. "I've been expecting you." Sarah Mitchell stood at the kitchen window of her small farmhouse, watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and pink. Her newborn daughter Emma slept peacefully in the wooden cradle that her husband Tom had made with his own hands just weeks before. The baby was only 3 days old, and Sarah's heart swelled with a love so fierce it almost frightened her. Tom had left early that morning to check on their cattle, as he did every day. Their ranch was small compared to the sprawling properties that surrounded them, but it was theirs. They had worked side by side for 5 years to build something from nothing, surviving droughts, harsh winters, and the constant struggle of making ends meet on the unforgiving frontier. Sarah had met Tom when she was just 18, fresh from the East Coast where her father had lost everything in a bad business deal. She had come west with nothing but hope and determination, taking a job as a schoolteacher in the growing town of Cedar Creek. Tom was different from the other men she had met. He was gentle with his hands, but strong in his convictions, and he treated her like an equal partner rather than property. Their courtship had been slow and sweet. Tom would visit her after school, helping her clean the one-room schoolhouse and walking her home through the dusty streets. He spoke of his dreams to build a life on the land, to raise cattle, and maybe even horses someday. When he finally asked her to marry him, Sarah knew she had found her place in the world. The first years of their marriage had been challenging, but happy. They lived in a small cabin while Tom built their house board by board. Sarah continued teaching until she became pregnant with Emma, and together they had slowly expanded their herd of cattle from a dozen head to nearly 50. But everything changed 3 months ago when Tom borrowed money from Marcus Wheeler, the most powerful rancher in the territory. Wheeler owned thousands of acres and had his fingers in every business deal for miles around. Tom had needed the money to buy medicine for the cattle when a disease swept through their herd. Without treatment, they would have lost everything. Wheeler had seemed friendly enough when he offered the loan, even congratulating them on Sarah's pregnancy. But the terms were harsh, and the interest rate was higher than anything the bank would charge. Tom had been desperate, and Wheeler knew it. Now, with Emma just born and Sarah still weak from childbirth, the debt hung over them like a storm cloud. They owed Wheeler $1,500, more money than they had ever seen at one time. The payment was due in 2 weeks, and they had maybe $300 to their name. Sarah heard hoofbeats approaching and looked out to see Tom riding hard toward the house. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he sat rigid in the saddle. Something was wrong. Tom burst through the front door, his face pale and his eyes wild with panic. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his voice shaking. Wheeler was just here with his men. Sarah's blood ran cold. Marcus Wheeler never made social calls, especially not at dawn. What did he want? Tom sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands. "The payment. He wants the full amount by tomorrow, not next week. Says he's calling in all his debts early." "But we don't have it," Sarah whispered. "He knows we don't have it. That's not the worst part." Tom looked up at her, and Sarah saw tears in his eyes. "He made me an offer. He says he'll forgive the debt and give us another $1,000 on top of it." Sarah felt hope flicker in her chest. "That's wonderful. What does he want in return?" Tom was quiet for so long that Sarah began to feel sick. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. He wants you, Sarah, as payment for the debt." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "What do you mean?" "He wants you to come work for him, live in his house, be his companion." Tom couldn't meet her eyes. "He says it's a common arrangement on the frontier, that plenty of women have made similar deals to help their families." Sarah's mind reeled. She knew what Wheeler was really asking for, and it had nothing to do with honest work. She also knew that Wheeler was a man who always got what he wanted, one way or another. Stories circulated about people who had crossed him, and none of them ended well. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "He'll take everything. The ranch, the cattle, the house. He has the legal right to do it." Tom's voice broke. "We'd be left with nothing, Sarah. We'd lose everything we've worked for, and we'd still owe him money we can't pay." Sarah looked down at Emma, sleeping so peacefully in her cradle. Her daughter deserved better than a life of poverty and uncertainty. She deserved a chance to grow up safe and secure, even if it meant Sarah had to sacrifice her own happiness. But there was something else in Tom's eyes, something that made Sarah's stomach twist with dread. "Tom, what aren't you telling me?" Tom stood up and began pacing the small kitchen. "He gave me until sunset to decide. But, Sarah, he also said that if we refuse, he'll make sure we never work anywhere in this territory again. He owns too many people, has too much influence. We'd be blacklisted." The full weight of their situation settled on Sarah's shoulders. This wasn't just about debt or money anymore. This was about Wheeler's desire for power and control, and his willingness to destroy lives to get what he wanted. "There has to be another way," Sarah said desperately. "We could sell everything and leave. Start over somewhere else." Tom shook his head. "With what money? And where would we go with a newborn baby? We don't have family anywhere, and winter's coming." He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "Sarah, I've thought about this all night. Maybe it's the only way to protect you and Emma." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You're actually considering this?" "Wheeler isn't a violent man," Tom said quickly. "He's wealthy, respected in town. You'd live in a fine house, have servants, never want for anything. And it might not be permanent. Maybe after a year or two, we could work out some other arrangement." The betrayal in Sarah's heart was almost unbearable. Her husband, the man who had promised to love and protect her, was actually discussing selling her to another man like she was a piece of livestock. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice icy. "What about Emma?" "I'd keep the ranch, raise Emma. You could visit whenever Wheeler allows it." Tom's words came out in a rush, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "It's not ideal, but families have been separated before. People do what they have to do to survive." Sarah turned away from him and walked to Emma's cradle. Her daughter stirred slightly, making tiny baby noises that tugged at Sarah's heart. She had brought this precious life into the world only 3 days ago, and now she might be forced to leave her. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked without turning around. "Wheeler will be back at sunset. He wants an answer then." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She heard Tom's footsteps behind her, and then his hands were on her shoulders. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I never wanted this to happen. I thought I could build something for us, make a good life. Instead, I've ruined everything." She didn't turn around or respond to his touch. Part of her felt sorry for Tom, knowing he was trapped just as much as she was. But another part of her was angry that he would even consider Wheeler's proposal. A real man would find another way, or at least go down fighting. The day passed slowly and painfully. Sarah tried to focus on Emma, feeding her and holding her close, memorizing every detail of her perfect little face. Tom spent most of the day outside, unable to meet Sarah's eyes for more than a few moments at a time. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't let her family lose everything because of her pride. Emma deserved a chance at a good life, even if it meant Sarah had to sacrifice her own freedom. But as she prepared to tell Tom her choice, the sound of hoofbeats outside made them both freeze. Through the window, Sarah could see Wheeler approaching with 2 of his men, just as he had promised. Marcus Wheeler was a tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes. He dressed in expensive clothes that marked him as wealthy, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to getting his way. When he dismounted his horse and walked toward their door, Sarah felt like prey watching a predator approach. Tom opened the door before Wheeler could knock. "Mr. Wheeler." "Tom." "Sarah." Wheeler tipped his hat politely, as if this was a normal social call. "I trust you've had time to consider my proposal." Sarah stepped forward, holding Emma protectively against her chest. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "I'll go with you." Wheeler's cold smile made her skin crawl. "Excellent. I knew you were a sensible woman." He gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward with a leather bag. "Tom, here's the money I promised. $1,000, plus forgiveness of your debt." Tom took the bag with shaking hands. Sarah noticed he couldn't look at her as he counted the money. "Now then," Wheeler continued. "Sarah, you'll need to pack a few things. Nothing too extensive, mind you. I'll be providing everything you need from now on." Sarah's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stay standing. "Now," Wheeler said simply. No point in dragging this out. It's harder on everyone that way. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Sarah packed a small bag with her few personal possessions, including the silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She wrote a quick letter for Emma to have when she was older, explaining that everything she did was out of love. The hardest part was saying goodbye to Emma. Sarah held her daughter one last time, whispering promises she hoped she could keep. "I'll come back for you," she whispered. "Somehow, someday, I'll come back." Tom finally looked at her as she prepared to leave. "Sarah, I don't," she said sharply. "Just take care of our daughter." As she walked toward Wheeler's horse, Sarah felt like she was walking to her own execution. Wheeler helped her mount behind him, his hands lingering longer than necessary on her waist. The message was clear. She belonged to him now. As they rode away from the only home she had ever known, Sarah looked back to see Tom standing in the doorway, holding Emma. The sight of her husband counting Wheeler's money while their daughter cried in his arms was burned into her memory forever. Wheeler's ranch was everything Sarah had expected and more. The main house was a sprawling two-story structure with fine furniture and expensive decorations brought in from back east. Sarah was given a room on the second floor, complete with a beautiful four-poster bed and a wardrobe full of expensive dresses. But the luxury couldn't disguise what she really was, a prisoner in a gilded cage. Wheeler made his expectations clear from the first night. Sarah was to act as his companion at social gatherings, his hostess when he entertained guests, and his mistress when they were alone. In return, she would live comfortably, and her family would be left alone. The weeks that followed were the darkest of Sarah's life. She went through the motions of her new existence, wearing the clothes Wheeler bought her, and appearing at his side when required. But, inside, she was dying a little more each day. The only thing that kept her sane was the thought of Emma. Tom brought the baby to visit once a week, and those brief hours were both the highlight and the torture of Sarah's existence. Each visit reminded her of what she had lost, and what she was fighting to protect. But, as the weeks turned into months, Sarah began to notice things about Wheeler's operation that made her stomach turn. He wasn't just a wealthy rancher. He was a man who made his money by destroying other people's lives. The loans he offered to desperate families always came with impossible terms. And when people couldn't pay, he took everything they owned. Sarah realized she wasn't the only woman who had been forced into this arrangement. Wheeler's housekeeper, Maria, had once been married to a small farmer who couldn't pay his debts. His cook, Anna, had been traded by her husband to settle a gambling debt. Wheeler had built his empire on the suffering of others, and Sarah was just the latest victim in a long line of broken families and shattered dreams. But something inside Sarah refused to accept this fate. She began to watch and listen, learning about Wheeler's business dealings and the fear he used to control people. She discovered that many of the townspeople hated him, but were too afraid to speak out. Late at night, when Wheeler was away on business, Sarah would sit by her window and plan. There had to be a way out of this nightmare, not just for her, but for all of Wheeler's victims. She just had to find it. One evening, as Sarah served dinner to Wheeler and several of his business associates, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Wheeler was planning to expand his operation, targeting more small ranchers and farmers. He bragged about how easy it was to manipulate desperate people, especially women with children. That night, as Sarah lay in the bed that felt like a prison, she made a promise to herself and to Emma. She would find a way to destroy Marcus Wheeler and everything he had built on the misery of others. She didn't know how yet, but she would find a way. The next morning brought unexpected hope in the form of a new ranch hand Wheeler had hired. Sarah watched from her window as a tall, weather-beaten cowboy rode up to the main house. There was something different about him, something in the way he carried himself that reminded her of the man Tom used to be before fear and desperation had broken him. The cowboy's name was Jake Morrison, and from the moment Sarah saw him, she knew her life was about to change again. The question was whether it would be for better or for worse.